Ashe. Ashe. Yes, give it up, absolutely. So that drum is calling you into this room, into this space, out of your day, out of all the things that you left behind when you crossed the threshold into this place. So behold, you have made it. You have passed through. You have come to a gathering of self, of community, of memory, and of reflection. So ashe and welcome. Yes. What an honor to be here with all of you tonight. My name is Karilyn Crockett. I am a lecturer at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and I am just happy to be here. Happy to be here, happy to represent MIT a little bit, but most especially happy to represent Dorchester, which is home, which is where I'm from and I was born, and happy to rep every single night. So very happy to be here. Thank you. Such an honor to come here tonight and to really lift up this incredible series. So the Chuck Turner Black Arts Trust and Lecture Series is a blessing, is a vector of knowledge, is a cipher of truth, rapturing all of us up together, not just tonight, but so many nights that have brought us here. So I really want to make sure to recognize the power of the series. I was here for the very first lecture in the series given by Chuck Turner himself. That's right, yeah, which was powerful. And so to imagine myself as a part of the series is something that I could not have imagined. So I'm really humbled to stand before you, and I think you're in for a really special evening. So happy that we can be blessed by Abigail and her work and all that we're about to receive tonight. So thank you again for being here. So I just really want to just take a minute to just honor again the life and legacy and powerful witness of Chuck Turner himself, who is his name that this series is named for. And Chuck's work has just been so incredible as a long distance example of what it means to run for the long haul. This is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And Chuck's entire life story exemplifies that truth. And so we are honoring him as well as the reality of a long distance run of work tonight. So that is a big part of what binds this circle, even though we're not really in a circle, but the room is held by a circle, the circle of the drum and the circle of our hearts for tonight for sure. I also want to call out the remarkable work of the Boston Redeemer Project, which holds us in the fearless, and the fearless and visionary leadership of Mia Evans, who assembles us here. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Because you do not have work like this, you do not get work like this done without powerful leaders who are undaunted, who are fearless and who persevere for us. So thank you, Mia, for assembling us all tonight. Exactly. Yes. Give it up for Mia. So with that, I wish you all a good evening, and I would ask you to turn to your neighbor and wish your neighbor a good evening. Say hello to your neighbor. Tell them your name. Yes. Introduce yourself. Thank you. Please. Yes. There it is. Love that. Love up on each other. That's right, because community is in the room. So, I have titled my remarks for tonight, it's painful to call it a lecture, but I guess it kind of is that too. It's a lecture series. I can talk a lot, so I'm going to try to minimize what I'm going to do for you. But tonight I titled my remarks, Chaos or Movement Building, Where Do We Go From Here? And I know just about everyone here will recognize my title's echo of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s well-known book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. King wrote this book in 1967. And there's the book there. This was the last full-length book that he would write before being murdered the very next year. Here we encounter a very different person than the 1963 I Have a Dream Martin. This is the cover from the yeah, will show the detail. This book was published in 1967, yeah, but this cover is the 1997 edition, which is the Beacon Press edition, which was published right here. So Beacon Press, a really well-known radical Unitarian press that really has a lot of King's work and papers, and we should know that and be proud of that here. So, so this book comes out in 67, and like I was saying, this is a very different Martin Luther King who's writing this book than the one that we celebrate when we talk about the I Have a Dream speech, where there's this sort of soaring rhetoric was somehow really capturing the imagination of the nation and the movement. In 1967, King is worried. He's weary. He's stressed. He's increasingly aware of his mortality amidst a growing number of death threats. And he is really concerned about the fragmentation of a social movement that he helped build. I take inspiration from this book tonight because in it, Dr. King is imagining and looking toward a future that we are all sitting in right now. Even though 50 plus years ago, when this work was written, many of us here maybe were not born. Some of us were born, some of us weren't. Thanks. But the drum majors for justice, like Dr. King and Chuck Turner, were thinking of us more than 50 years ago. We're imagining a future for us more than 50 years ago. And we're sitting in rooms not unlike this, thinking about the future. And so tonight, I want us to imagine that we are imagining the next 50 years for those that are unborn. And what does it mean to take seriously that kind of charge? Where you are imagining the future that we need. You're imagining a kind of radical inclusivity, a kind of love of people, of community, of peace, that it would take to get us from here to there. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about three things, essentially. One, I want to talk about the big lessons from past social movements and what they can teach us today, right now. Some of you know that I have written this book about the Boston anti-highway movement. I've been talking about it, it's like all over the place. Share a little bit of that story and kind of pull out some of the lessons from a story that we can be proud of because of a story that we fought right here, or a story that we won right here, and a story that we need to continue to learn from right here. The second thing I want to talk about is how Boston itself has been a leader in revolutionary, grassroots-led urban design, policy, and planning. That is something we can also be proud of. So as I mentioned, I teach in an urban planning department, and this profession gets a lot of things wrong all the time. And so it is incredible to really learn from the people who have gotten that right. And over again, it has been people in neighborhoods organizing, resisting, pushing, movement building. That is where our knowledge is. That is where our power is. And so if I'm doing anything on a good day, is trying to bring some of that knowledge and power into the academy, into the classroom, because that's where the lessons are really coming from. The third thing I want to talk a little bit about is the work that remains. We are not done. We are not done. We are not done. There's so much work to do to move us forward and toward this type of equity-centered future that communities of color need and deserve. This is not an abstract thing. This is a thing to be built, to be imagined, to be held. And so when I invite you all to imagine yourselves as building a particular type of future 50 years out or not, that is not a fantastical, made-up game. That is a real invitation to tactically build bricks. And that is what we are engaged in, what we need to be engaged in tonight and forward. So how can we think about all that is required and all is needed to repair generations of wealth dispossession, displacement, and political disenfranchisement? That work does not resolve itself overnight, and it requires all of us to be engaged in battle. But first, let's hear what King has to say to us from 1967. And I ask you to forgive the gender conventions of the time, but here the intent of his message. He dedicates Where Do We Go From Here, quote, to the committed supporters of the civil rights movement, Negro and white, whose steadfastness amid confusions and setbacks gives assurance that the brotherhood will be the condition of man, not the dream of man. So I hope that the dated and problematic pronoun and gendered language here does not prevent you from hearing King's full intention. He is imploring us to choose human connection, to choose your neighbor, to choose the bond of community, mutuality as our rightful daily condition and not a dream. In his writing, he toils with the idea that chaos and dissension was bubbling up around him and through the civil rights movement as a younger generation continued to really question racial integration and as a goal, right? They're like, racial integration is not meaningful to us. It is causing our death and annihilation. That is not what we're out here fighting for. Is there something else? Black nationalists are calling for not nonviolent civil disobedience as a tactic, but something more resounding. They're calling for Black power and armed resistance, and this concerned King. He was frustrated and made him question the movement's ability to grow and to advance, despite the gains won by the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65. In this quote, you hear his frustration, his rumination, clearly as he ponders what's next, even as he seems to be consoling himself a bit. He writes again, he says, the line of progress, and this is the thing for us to hold on to, the line of progress is never straight. For a period, a movement may follow a straight line, and then it encounters obstacles, and the path bends. It's like curving around a mountain when you are approaching a city. Often it feels as though you are moving backward, and you lose sight of your goal, but in fact you are moving ahead, and soon you will see the city again closer by. 52 years ago, when King wrote these words, clearance for urban renewal and interstate highway expansion threatened to erase hard-working urban communities right off the map of the United States from coast to coast. At that moment, we had a choice: chaos or movement building. We had already chosen community, and now it was time to build a new future as only movements can do. In 1967, many national liberation movements were hanging in the balance. Understand that. That is a true thing. Wondering what was their direction, forward or back, straight, bent, gone, chaos or community. The civil rights movement was turning. The anti-Vietnam War movement was building. The student movement was fracturing. The future was uncharted and less than hopeful. This was the moment when our future was being imagined, was being crafted, was trying to be prepared for now. Greater Boston at this time took to the streets to fight back against the state's plan to bring I-95 and its looped inner belt through our metropolitan core. No one knew what would happen, and most people thought it was utterly impossible to stop a federal highway from tearing through economically disinvested, multiracial neighborhoods where most residents were dismissed as politically irrelevant. But we stood up as a city and as a region. We stood up and we fought. The Greater Boston expansion of I-95 represented not only a 10 to 12 lane highway bringing lots and lots of cars to the heart of the city, but also billions of dollars of federal investment. By all accounts, this fight was a huge success, and I-95 and the inner belt were stopped. But the period raised up lots of questions for us. Again, the question being chaos or movement building. Where do we go and what do we do? So let's look at this story that I've given you a broad overview. You know how it is. We stopped the highway, we built a new park, and we got some new trains, we got some tot lots, we got some basketball courts, and what else? What else is the lesson of this story? So let's look at its beginning. So here you are looking at the high water mark of the anti-highway movement itself. This is January 25th, 1969, and this is about 2,000 residents from across the greater Boston converging on the steps of the State House to confront Governor Sargent, who, to his credit, would come out a few minutes later and greet this group. There on your right is Governor Francis Sargent himself. He had been the head of the Department of Public Works, which was the agency that was in charge of creating the State Highway Plan, a plan that was first authored in 1948. This plan sets forward a schema for a six highway radial system that would surround Boston and bring cars from east, west, north, and south into the city's core, north upward to New Hampshire, Maine, and south through to Rhode Island. So if you look at this picture, you get a pretty good sense of what the crowd was like. Vibrant, diverse, determined, and extremely unimpressed by the governor. So if you look at their faces, if you look at everyone, I always try to point out the altar boys because they look especially unimpressed by their governor. On this day, all of these people had traveled by foot, some by bus. There was a flyby by a helicopter where folks had come from, again, all over the region to really push the sergeant on his position, which at this time was a pro-highway position. Lots of federal money through the Federal Highway Act was released in 1956 to make funding available for this road. The governor was in support of it, the president was in support of it, local mayors, state officials were in support of it, except many people in the neighborhoods that would be affected by the highway said no. And so when they said no, it would fast forward us to think about how the actual city of Boston and Cambridge and Somerville would be spared so much clearance because of what the road would have brought. And in the end, what we got was new investments in mass transit, new investments in outdoor and recreation space. So for those of you that ride the Orange Line, who are my Orange Line people that are here? Okay, great. A lot of you got some new train cars. I heard that's true. Yeah. Okay. So when you ride,
it's a myth.
It's a myth.
No one's ever seen them.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's good to know. So if you've been on the Orange Line recently, every time you get on the Orange Line, not only are you celebrating this incredible grassroots victory, but you are actually riding the route of what would have been the highway. So when you go from Forest Hills, you go from Jamaica Plain, and you go through Roxbury into South End, that is what would have been the highway's alignment. And so also when you then go to Roxbury Crossing, you can look outside of Roxbury Crossing and you see this plaque that's there, which is celebrating the story of this victory of fighting, again, I-95's pathway into the city. So residents are really concerned that people wouldn't know the story. And so they wanted to make sure this plaque was put in place so that people would know the story of this victory and what it took. And if you look at the top of this plaque, there are about 150, almost 200 names of people who were instrumental in winning the success of this fight. The very first name on this plaque is Chuck Turner's name. So if you ever go by, many of you have seen this plaque, please take a minute to pay homage to the people who have fought on our behalf and really want to make sure that the story of this victory was truly inscribed in the landscape of the city itself. So there's Chuck himself, right, in his glory, in this moment in the 1960s in particular. I think this picture is actually later, for sure, but is actually his relationship to this other person. Does anyone know who that picture is? This other person? Who is it? Absolutely, Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, who many of you will know because of his leadership in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also his essential role in the development of the Black Panther Party. It is the relationship between Chuck Turner and Stokely Carmichael that many people don't know that there was a deep friendship there. That friendship would be transformative to the development of the anti-highway fight here and also to the expansion of Black radicalism on the ground in Boston. The two of them would go on to continue to be in conversation and really forge a relationship through some organizing in Selma during a voter registration fight or a campaign that also Byron Rushing was involved in as well. And so, in this next slide a little bit, it's just an excerpt of an interview that I had with Chuck Turner where he's basically talking about his relationship with Stokely and he and Byron going to Selma in '65 as a part of this demonstration that I talked about. And that it's essentially in '68 later that Stokely Carmichael would tell Chuck and others that he was really concerned about the FBI and a federal crackdown on Black civil rights and nationalist organizations. And he's essentially proposing here that many organizations come together under a united umbrella to create something known as the Black United Front. There will be several Black United Fronts all over the country, including here in Boston, and that organization existed as an underground organization until Dr. King's assassination. When Dr. King was assassinated, again, this underground organization would become an above-ground organization and assert itself as the Black United Front. This is significant to our story because this organization would release this document, a document of 21 demands, which would declare a state of emergency in Boston's Black community on our April 7th or 8th, 1968, so just a couple days after Dr. King's April 4th assassination. And in this document, you will see that the next, it's demand number 19 that calls for the halt of the planned Interbelt and the construction related to the highway. And so it's an amazing example of how Black radical and Black nationalist politics are finding their way into a very material expression through urban planning and design of a city, and really asserting a clear sense of community control, of self-determination of space, of self-determination of urban development itself, and situating the Black United Front and Chuck Turner right into the center of that politics. So this brings us front and center into a conversation about interstate highway expansion, right? So at this time in the country, if you can imagine, based on President Eisenhower's signing of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, there was a tremendous amount of federal money that was released that would be responsible for the development of the interstate highway system. And so essentially what you're looking at is about 46,000 miles of asphalt. And an infrastructure system that represents about $400 billion of direct investment. And exactly at the time where the interstate highway system is expanding, you're looking at a reorganization of space, of cities and towns that are really following this example of really marking space through the needs of people who are car owners, car drivers. The vast majority of car owners and drivers at this time are men, are typically heterosexual men in suburbs. And so what organizers would pull the layer back on is the way that this was really showing a pattern, a social pattern that was heteronormative, and the fact that it was prioritizing and privileging white suburban male drivers. And so when you look at it this way, you see a map that is very much challenging what would have been the high watermark of the civil rights movement. So if you think about Brown in 1954, using the law to create a racially integrated social order and vision, that is a torque. So you have a map that's actually moving toward racial disintegration, sort of a heteronormative pattern there, and another kind of social vision, which is arguing for a different kind of racial integration and expression of the civil rights group. So a very different opposite type of pattern that's actually being expressed at the same moment. For many suburban communities, these roads were celebrated. So this is a celebration in Wisconsin in 1958, where the completion of a segment of the road was greeted by Miss Road, highway queens that were inaugurated in some of these suburban towns, and by politicians and business owners that would celebrate road expansion as something that they felt like they were proud of. It represented progress. It represented something that was noteworthy. Following the assassination of Dr. King and some of what we had seen in terms of urban renewal fights In many urban communities, particularly where there were Black and working class populations, a lot of what was going on in the cities were not celebrations, but were explosions, were riots, uprisings. Again, this is the same moment. And so what I'm asking you to think about is how can we hold two very different visions of what is going on in the city, how roads are being organized, how the federal government is investing in place, causing two extremely different, almost catastrophic results in sometimes the same places. This is looking at on the streets of Detroit in 1967, showing you the aftermath of uprisings again there based on Dr. King's assassination. And so we're in a moment of tremendous unrest. We're in a moment where the country is really struggling to ask itself that question: chaos or community? Chaos or movement building? What are we deciding in terms of the vision that we have for ourselves in terms of the future that we want to create? More visions there. This is another image there for you of Detroit, just showing what it would mean for federal authority to assert itself in the cities that are trying to, at this time, trying to capture, trying to maintain peace, a law and order, a statist vision of what that is, obviously showing surveillance, showing police brutality, which would lead to another set of movement, organizing, and conversation at the state and federal level. Many of you that are familiar with the Kerner Commission's report, a report that would speak directly to over 100 uprisings that would happen before Dr. King's assassination, and then some of those actions that would happen after, and really set a national conversation about what it means for a country that is literally coming unglued racially, economically, and otherwise. And so back to our story here. In the midst of all of this, the expansion of I-95 on the East Coast is the story we're talking about. And so we know that I-95 runs in a continuous stretch from Maine to Florida. We're looking at about 1,900 miles of asphalt. There are 2 breaks in this ribbon. You can imagine what those breaks are. Maybe one of them. One break would be what? Would be? Well, maybe not. Okay. Ooh, oh, I'm so glad I'm here. Okay, yes?
Part of it is in Washington, D.C., the other part is Philadelphia.
Okay, really?
Not so much the break, it's the way it winds around.
Way it winds around. Okay. All right, so let me rephrase the question then. So essentially, I-95 again goes in this continuous loop, aside from 2 places, 2 cities where there were deliberate actions to stop the road's expansion. Boston is one of them. Because we said no, because we said hell no, because we protested. Remember that's part of the story, we protested, we stopped. Okay, so yes, no I-95 here, we stopped that, okay? The other place is actually Portland, Maine. So there's still a lot of debate about what will happen in terms of the I-95 expansion through downtown Portland, a story that's still unfolding. But for the most part, all of the cities that are on this map, whether it's New York or Philly or DC or Jacksonville, you can take I-95 into those downtowns. And originally you were meant to be able to take I-95 into downtown Boston as well. But as you all know, you cannot do that, correct? Right, so you have to either get on the Mass Pike, or you have to try to get on 93, you have to get on Route 2, you have to do all these things to try to get into the city, because the last 10 miles of I-95 were never completed, because that was the part of this controversy. And so because we said no, you have to figure out a different way, but luckily we were able to save the urban fabric of the city. And so let's look at what that would have meant. So I don't know if you can see it so well from where you sit, but essentially what you're looking at, the dotted lines are showing you what would have been the proposed route of I-95. And particularly if you look to the top of the slide, if you're looking again toward Peabody, that dotted line would have brought you down and connected you through the center. So that inner belt loop is going through many of the neighborhoods, going through the South End, going through Brookline, going through Cambridge, and connecting you to those radial dots. That inner belt is an inner circumferential road, which is echoing, you can see the shape of 128. This was seen as the future. This was seen as progress. This was seen as the way that the city would resolve the fact that so many residents at this time were leaving the city. Boston was losing thousands and thousands of people for a period of about 40 years, and we're right in the middle of that. 1950 to 1960, 70, 80, Boston starts gaining population again in the 90s, but this was a moment where the city was losing lots of residents, particularly white residents. And so the highway plan was a way to win those people back and make them stay here. The fact that we saw this not as an invitation, as an opportunity, but as a threat, was a very different kind of grassroots organizing tactic and analysis that was then elevated to create new policy. So this is an image of what that proposed road would have looked like. So if you've been to Roxbury Crossing and you've seen that plaque that I pointed out, this image is from that plaque. And it's showing you essentially an eastward-facing alignment. So we are, if you look to your left, that housing development there is essentially Mission Extension or Alice Taylor Homes. So you're basically at Ruggles Station. So you're looking at in the middle of an alignment of Columbus Ave and Tremont, looking toward downtown. To the top left there is the Prudential Building. So this 10 to 12 lane road would be about 10 stories at its height, bringing about 160 to 180,000 cars a day into the city. And so, although the highway designers and planners show you a very lovely looking image of roads that never ever has traffic, ever. You never get into a traffic jam when the highway planners draw these things. It always looks amazing. You have lots of trees, but the reality is the amount of noise, the amount of trash, the amount of traffic, and just the chaos of this would have been really devastating to the 5 public housing developments that we know are there, including Alice Taylor Homes, Whittier Street, Lenox, and other places that are right there. So it really challenges us to imagine that this could have been what our fate would have left us with. And so we have many people to thank for really pulling together and trying to tell this bigger story and to try to imagine a different kind of future for us. And so these are some of the folks who were really seminal to this fight. You have Mildred Haley, there from Bromley Heath, Femke Rosenbaum, Chuck Turner, of course, Ann Hirschfang, Gloria Fox, just to name a few. Byron himself is there always, David Lee, Tony Pangaro, Tony Lee, some of the people who were really instrumental in saying no, and then also trying to think about what is the strategy for what you want to build. And the idea that it's not enough to say we don't want a road in our midst, we really want to figure out what we could turn this land into, what would be the uses that would really help us address at the time what would have been, what was a housing crisis, what was an investment crisis, what was an educational crisis, and what would be the way forward for that. This gives you a sense of what the devastation looked like at the time. In 1966, clearance for the highway began in Boston. So this image that you're looking at here is roughly between Roxbury Crossing and Ruggles. And so giving you a sense of what it looked like based on the fact that about 500 businesses were lost when the road planning and the road actual clearance began. So this woman looking over her shoulder very suspiciously, very hesitantly, kind of wondering who is the photographer. This a photographer from the Boston Globe took this picture, and but again gives you the sense of what the city looked like. At the top, right there is in the shadow is the Prudential Building, just to orient you so you can see where you are. But just again to imagine what that level of devastation would have been like if you lived there, or if you had a business there and you were waiting to see what might happen. This was the rallying call of the fight itself. So Stop I-95, so People Before Highways, was the way that people in this movement called themselves to action. This was their name for it. And the story is that people came together in the middle of the night and got some paint. Ron Hafer was one of the folks, I'm told, who put up this sign as a way to let people know that they were not only organizing and present, but they were a bit nervous. This was a moment in in the late 60s, where people were just not sure what the fate would be, if the road was going to come or not going to come. So the image I showed you before of the cleared landscape spoke to this moment of like a very tenuous time when people just really didn't know what was going to happen. And so the sign was put up as a way to almost give the movement a bit of a shot in the arm to say, we're here, we're steadfast, and we're very clear about what's important to us. Some of you will remember this. In fact, you remember not only the sign, but the fact that this was the elevated train that was there. And so there was an elevated train we know that ran along Washington Street to Dudley Square in downtown, if you know that. And many of you also know that the elevated train that ran to JP was on this embankment. You may also know that when this embankment was taken down, a lot of the granite stones that you see were then used to pave out the Southwest Corridor Park. So many of the planters, the places where you can sit, are actually the stone from the elevated wall that's there. So part of it already. So then we are sort of back to where we started. And you had a chance to kind of get through some of those hard years of people just trying to imagine a movement, trying to think about what the parts would be, how do you engage residents, how do you imagine a different kind of use for the space. In 1969, when protesters calmly came to the front steps of the State House to make a demand on Governor Sargent and others, they were really clear that there was a new politics that they were not only articulating, but demanding for themselves and from their government. About 8 or so months before that, on August 6, 1968, protesters had showed up on those same steps at a silent vigil for Dr. King. And so Boston was a bit unique in that we didn't have this sort of a violent uprisings that happened in the wake of Dr. King's death, but there was still an assertive kind of confrontation with the state and government in terms of asserting this new Black is beautiful politic. And many of you will know that right now it doesn't sound particularly radical to us. In 1968, to assert Black is beautiful was very, very radical. So you're not asserting Negro, you're not asserting color, you're asserting Black is beautiful, not just as an aesthetic claim, but as a particular type of politic for how you are relating to the state, how are you relating to yourself, and how are you trying to make sure that your claims and needs are being met in the way that you imagine. And so it's a really lovely image of sort of these two movements that are also articulating themselves on the very front steps of the building there. And so then we come back to what happened to the governor. So Governor Sargent himself says on February 11th, 1970, so just a year later, he says, 4 years ago, I was the commissioner of the Department of Public Works, our road building agency. Then nearly everyone was sure highways were the only answer to transportation problems for years to come. We were wrong. This was a statement that was made on television. And in that incredible about face that Governor Sargent makes, he changes history because he was pushed to do so, because the people in the neighborhoods and organizers really forced his hand, causing the cancellation of the roads, causing the governor and others to say that they would go to Washington to get federal money to make new kinds of investments in mass transit. Not only did they go and lobby for this, but they were able to change federal law. So the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1973 has this thing called the Interstate Highway Provision, which essentially originally was called the Boston Transfer Provision, which means that federal money could be used for mass transit. So very simple, but a very big deal at the time, because before then there had been no such set aside, there had been no such precedent. And so then, essentially with that, we basically get what we need to lay out the Southwest Corridor Park and to be able to dedicate the Orange Line and the park itself in 87. And so 1987 winds up being the time when we mark a very longer timeline that extended back to the 70s, back through the 60s, back through this 50s moment, and we can really look at that as an example of what that long-term organizing standpoint looks like and means. So, you still with me? You got it? That was a lot. That was fast, okay? So I wanted to make sure you got what you needed to not only ride the orange line with power and focus, but to really, again, ask ourselves these kinds of questions. What were the lessons? What are the takeaways? A history lesson is kind of boring, is kind of interesting, kind of necessary to figure out what we keep and what we pick up. And then, of course, this question of what do we do now? Where do we go from here with this work? And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is to figure out how to wake up our memory of these stories. And so we've been working on this project called Hacking the Archive with a group of partners around the city, some of whom are in this room, like Claudia, hey. And the Boston Ujima Project is in the mix too. And we decided to have a reenactment of that day, of January 25th, 1969. The 50th anniversary of that protest march was this year. In 2019, and so we brought many of those activists back to the State House to share their stories, to share their witness, and to begin a conversation with not only, okay, a history lesson is boring, it's nice, it's great, but who cares? What do you do when people actually are still living those stories? When we remember the point that the work is not done, that the battles are still real. And so this was a moment to not only commemorate that fight, but to actually ask for guidance and expertise about what we do next. And so then we rolled this into this project called Hacking the Archive, which is literally trying to look at archival materials, documents, photographs, stories, to try to think about future movement building, and to use these resources to really bring about a more robust understanding of anti-colonial struggle, countercultural movement building that has happened here and elsewhere. And so we had this rally, again, to reenact the historic day, and also had a hackathon at MIT in May, where lots of people came together to look at documents and to ask real questions about economic democracy, like that Ujima has been working on for ages, how to think about racial integration in schools, how to think about community land trust, and so much of the work at DSNI, because we want to make some connections. And so in this conversation is a discussion about connectivity, about lineages, about genealogies, and fights. And so we had this, and we had some time over the summer working. This is just some pictures of the crew assembling. Lamerty was in one of these pictures. Nia was a judge for the hackathon. Charles was in the room. So you'll see some people in these pictures that kind of give you a sense of what it means to wake up these kinds of stories. It is work to try to get our history together. And it takes some patience and fortitude to kind of get through. But once we get through, there is a payoff for sure. There's a payoff in terms of the energy and the creativity that it invites into the room, into the conversation. These are more pictures of the hackathon, people really working in teams all day to try to come up with new solutions. In the summer, we worked on trying to think through if the hack is basically a question or a creative problem-solving approach, how could we use a hack as a type of a strategy for engaging a larger public audience of non-specialists to answer a question that has to do with the past, but has total implications for the future and now. And so this idea of a fight genealogy is one of the animating ideas of this work, and again, trying to think through what is the connectivity of these different fights and of these different battles. And if I were to look at the Interstate Highway map again and talk about expansion of roads, expansion of urban renewals, Boston is not alone. We are not the only city that fought and defeated a highway. We didn't even join that fight particularly early. Many cities were engaged in these kinds of battles in the early part of the 60s or the late part of the 50s. And so how can we think about a bunch of different connections and fights across time and space as well? There's Chuck himself. So fast forwarding from not only 1969 and 68, but to today, this is Chuck again, also engaged in this conversation of hacking the archive and speaking to people who were at the hackathon itself, sharing his expertise, pushing back on the process at times so that it could be more informed by activism and his own story and witness. And so although the story is a larger story, much of this narrative is not possible without the biography and understanding the biography of Chuck himself as someone who was coming from the Midwest, from Ohio to Boston to go to school, the experience of being a student, the experience of being involved in the Northern student movement, and so many subsequent battles here on the ground for workers' rights and domestic violence issues as well. And so here is the final piece of it for us, which is hard to see, but imagine that what you're looking at is almost like the back of a cocktail napkin, if we were at a bar or a restaurant or something and we were sketching out some ideas. This is sort of a schematic of what it would mean to take seriously this idea of fight genealogies. How could a series of battles that were fought in the 60s, sustained through the 60s, but really animating a set of liberatory and revolutionary ideas about education, about housing, that's what you can't see, housing, economic self-determination, and what are some of the organizations that have flowed out of there. It's impossible to see. But in the bottom there, with DS&I, this film that was made for Chuck and Mel, the Boston Museum Project and Metco, these were the partner projects that we worked with this spring to try to trace out some of the connections, mostly to try to tell a story and to try to show if there might be some connections there. So the last piece of it is, right, and that could just play. And so what a bunch of students did over the summer was to pick up what the participants in the hackathon worked on in the spring, which is to say, if we imagined the city of Boston and its neighborhoods not as divided necessarily by a neighborhood boundary line, but as circled or shaped by lines that have to do with where particular activist movements have happened, people have lived, actions, protests, decisions have been made, and we try to actually, let's see, it's going to show you, populate the map with those actions, those people, and those decisions, then it would start to suggest not only a timeline, but a particular type of shape of the city and its ground that could actually be used to read into these other movements from time and space in different parts of the city. So a work in progress here, a beta, but the attempt here to create a new kind of tool for imagining not only the history of movement building, but what that means for work that's happening right now. So I think I'll stop it there, and then we can start a different kind of conversation about what it means to look at a map like this now. A map that in some ways is still sort of coming apart, but is still actually putting lots of pressure on communities that are still in need of investment. Communities that are still being displaced now, not because of federal investments due to urban renewal and highway expansion, but often now in 2019 because of private investment pressures that are causing new kinds of fragmentation patterns, new kinds of disinvestment patterns, disenfranchisement as well. So even though we have passed out of this historical moment of the 1960s, we are still struggling with the aftermath and the artifact of a particular type of planning scheme that is putting so many of us in communities we care about under assault. So I feel like that work not only is not finished, but gets new energy and new possibility because of organizations like the Boston Museum Project. So really happy to be here to hold the space and to see what else we can do to movement build and to really envision this future that is not just for now, but again, for so many years into to what we can see and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Karilyn. Thank you, Abigail. So good evening. So usually I do this at the top of the night, but we have the drumming go straight into Karilyn's talk. And if we could get a couple of chairs up here for Karilyn and Abigail. But I did want to make sure I did some introductions. Again, my name is Nia Evans. I'm with Boston Ujima Project, and I'd like to make sure I acknowledge our team. So walking down the middle of the room is Lucas Turner Owens, who is our fund manager. We also have Sarah Jacks, who's our communications organizer. In the back, talking to Shauna Bryant. We also have Charles Wallace Thomas IV, which is my favorite name in the entire world. He is our fund associate. We have Hendrix Berry. Where is Hendrix? Hi, Hendrix. Hendrix is our fund strategist. We have Pompey Das at the table, who's our member organizing manager. And we actually have a hire who is brand spanking new and trying to figure it all out, and she's scared, so she's not here tonight. Her name is Jenny. She's not scared. She's busy. Her name is Jenny Jeffrard, and she's our new business alliance coach. And you'll meet her soon. So Boston Ujima Project, for those who do not know, Ujima is Swahili for collective work and responsibility. And it is hard to succinctly describe Boston Ujima Project, but there are a few ways that we describe it. One is we say that it's a cooperative business, arts, and finance ecosystem. Another is that we say it's a cooperative economics infrastructure, and another is that we say it's a model of what our economies would look like if they were run by us. And by us, I mean Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And so what we have done is we have formed an ecosystem of some of our favorite initiatives and models. Another way that we describe it sometimes in that vein is it's a mashup of our favorite stuff. So at the center of that ecosystem is our membership body, and if you're a Ujima member, please raise your hand or stand if you're in the room. That includes you, Shauna, who's walking around. Cool. Alua, you're a member. And so two key features are our membership body and our fund, the Ujima Fund, which launched in December 2018. It's a $5 million fund, and I made history as the nation's first democratically governed investment fund. And what that means is that our members who live in Boston proper, so some of the people who raise their hands, are the ones who vote directly on what we invest in. Karilyn talked about community control of planning. And so as Karilyn has pointed out, this is our attempt at a robust community control of what is happening in our neighborhoods. Really quickly, before we go into Q&A, about Karilyn. So Karilyn introduced herself a little bit. She said she's the lecturer of public policy and urban planning at the MIT Urban Studies Department. Her research focuses on large-scale land use changes in 20th century American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Karilyn's new book, People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, and a New Movement for City Making, investigates the 1960s era grassroots movement to halt urban extension of the U.S. Interstate Highway. I think if you're behind the mic, you get feedback, right? So I think that's what's happening. System, and the geographic and political changes in Boston that resulted. Karilyn was the co-founder of Multicultural Youth Tour of What's Now, or My Town, an award-winning Boston-based educational nonprofit organization. My Town hired public high school students to research their local and family histories to produce youth-led walking tours for sale to public audiences. During its nearly 15 years of operation, My Town created jobs for more than 300 low and moderate income teenagers, who in turn led public walking tours for more than 14,000 visitors and residents. In a White House ceremony, the National Endowment for the Humanities cited My Town as one of 10 best youth humanities programs in America. Karilyn holds a PhD from the American Studies program at Yale University, a Master of Science in Geography from the London School of Economics, and a Master of Arts and Religion from Yale Divinity School. All right. Karilyn recently concluded 4 years of service with the Mayor's Office of Economic Policy and Research and the Director of Small Business Development for the City of Boston. Karilyn's career mission is to continue to work at the nexus of education, economic development, and urban revitalization. Again, a great honor to have Karilyn here. We've been looking forward to this for quite a while. When you walked in, you walked through an installation that was very impressively put together by Abigail DeVille. In the very short time that she had here, just want to say Abigail flew here from Cleveland today to do this installation, and so really want to thank her for her generosity and her flexibility. Abigail usually creates installations that takes days and sometimes months to create. Okay, more like weeks. Okay, all right, cool. So days, but sometimes weeks. So as I said, you walked through an installation that she created today after flying in from Cleveland. So about Abigail DeVille is a site-specific installation artist that exhibits across the United States and Europe. DeVille received an MFA from Yale University, so you all are Yale buddies, and a BFA from the Fashion Institute of Technology. She is the recipient of the 2014-15 fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the 2015 Creative Capital Grant, and the 2015 Obie Award for Design. Yep. DeVille is the 2017-18 Chuck Close Henry W. and Marion T. Mitchell Roan Prize Fellow. And DeVille's work has been exhibited at venues including the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Institute of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City, Cooper Gallery at Hudson Center, Harvard University, Cambridge, right up the street, the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis, and the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation in New York, to name a few. She has designed sets for theatrical productions as venues such as the Stratford Festival in 2014, Harlem Stage in 2016, La Mama in 2015, Jack from 2014 to 16, and Joe's Pub in 2014. And again, super excited to have Abigail here. Also looking forward to this for a while. And then finally, Toussaint had to leave. Toussaint was the drummer that you heard who was drumming inside the installation. He had to go to work. So here's his, very real, so here's his bio. Toussaint Liberator has inspired the Boston music scene with his unique and soulful voice ever since he arrived in 2001. Originally from Kokomo, Indiana, Toussaint was brought up as the son of a pastor and choir director and is blessed with a style and cadence that spans many genres and is deeply rooted in gospel. He quickly made a name for himself, initially recording with the band Red Pill. He then recorded an album with the China Band featuring the powerful voices of his mother and siblings on Love the Almighty High in 2003. In 2007, he wrote and recorded No Place Like Soul with the band Soul Live and was featured on their international tour, opening for legendary artists such as Isaac Hayes, the Rolling Stones, John Mayer, and Dave Matthews Band. In 2010, he made waves in the reggae scene when he wrote and released a solo album called Black Gold with producer Tippy Alfred of I Grade Records in St. Croix. His presence and undeniable charisma is hard-hitting and full of grit with a velvety sound that lingers in your mind long after the music. With that said, we'll now open this up for questions.
Hello, my name is Maxence Mateer, and I live in the community. And I did have a question for our speaker. Since you've been working at MIT, I know a lot of the urban planning and development students do find their way at working for the city of Boston. And we are, this is very timely because a lot of development is happening here in Roxbury, and I actually complained to a member in the city planning about some of the handicap access points, the sidewalk that were recently done, that they were actually raised. So I think there's a lot of lack of awareness as to what we need in the community and what's happening. So my question, and sorry for being long-winded, is are you in a position to be teaching some of these students who are taking courses at MIT for the master's program at least, so that you can bring your research to the forefront of what they should be thinking about as they are revitalizing a community?
What's your name?
Maxence?
Yeah,
Maxence.
thank you for the question. It is an urgent question in terms of how we think about planning education in the United States. I just came from this weekend. Can you hear me? I can speak louder.
Yeah. There's one mic. She has a microphone.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Is that a little bit better? No? Maybe?
Yeah,
That's better, okay. Sure, sorry about that. So I was saying that this weekend I was at the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, where basically there's a convening of schools that teach planning, and these kinds of questions, these kinds of issues are front and center in terms of what is happening in terms of graduate programs across the country that are preparing students to have a more robust understanding of their tools and the politics for making these things make sense. And I would say that the planning profession itself is still in a bit of a tailspin because of so much of what was wrong in terms of planning in the 60s. And so you'll see how that is expressed in terms of how planners at the BPDA and elsewhere are still struggling to figure out how do you listen and how do you take that productive listening and turn that into actual blueprints and policies that work. And so for you, I would say it sounds like you're pretty actively engaged in these conversations at the neighborhood level and also with the agency, and to continue to push there, because I don't think I would necessarily leave it to, as you're not, to planners or any of the students, because they're just, that time delay is real, and there's a political consequence for the way that planning is still not getting it right. But it means that the agencies themselves, including the BPDA, has much more work to do to get right with its community, and that's a true thing. Yeah.
Hi, I have the next question, and I have to go pick up my son from Pop Warner football in Mattapan, so I'm going to try to be brief and quick. I'm an organizer and director of transit-oriented development at Alternatives for Community and Environment. And what that means is that we are paying attention constantly to all the development that's happening in Dudley Square and in the city. And some transit-oriented, most transit-oriented. And then what are the plans for making that development, which, we all know is going to make the city unbearably dense. Then what are the plans to address mitigating that density with larger roads? And so a lot of times what's being proposed to us are new bus lanes and new bike lanes and lots of redesign. That means we cut down more trees. We have a local heat island issue. We have higher rates of air pollution, asthma, like you could just name, the highway might as well be here, right? And so my question to you, and thank you so much for your presentation and for reminding us that we're in a movement, we've been in a movement, we're still in a movement, and we've had many wins and we have many more wins to come. I appreciate that, I appreciate the presentation on that. But I would like to hear feedback on, for instance, the planned redesign of Malia Cass Boulevard, which, as we know, will connect the city back to 93.
Yep.
Thank you.
Before you go, I know you have to pick up your child. What's your thought about what you'd like to see there, Malia?
So I'm an advocate, and so that means that I have my own passions, but I don't speak for the community. I build platforms for the
Ask if
community.
you could give us a sense of what you think in this quiet room. We'll keep it quiet.
So I'm gonna boil it right down, right?
Yes.
A stands for Alternatives for Community and Environment. And so I'd like to see a lot more trees. I'd like to see, we're working right now on creating building standards so that the buildings are carbon neutral. So they're not adding to pollution in the environment, but taking pollution from the environment. And so that's what we're working on. In terms of road redesign, we'd like the city to be honest about their plans for putting sky rises in Dudley Square and what that means for how much traffic will have to be here. That's number 2. Number 3, I work with the BPA from every level of their process. And it's designed to make community voice a narrow part of what the RFP process looks like, what the design process looks like, the whole thing. So it's not just that the people who are graduating are not being trained to listen because they're trying their best. As soon as a community input comes from them, it goes to the BPA's lawyers. The lawyers decide if developers will be accountable or not. So the whole structure is not designed for us to influence it.
That's it, right?
Thank you, I have to go.
Thank you, Asha. And that was kind of Logan, by the way. Any response? Next question? Okay, great.
I just want to say thank you, Karilyn. Thank you for Town. Thank you for your PhD. Thank you for your work with people for highways. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you, Abigail. And thank you, Eugenia. And thank all of y'all. Attitude of gratitude. And now let me flip the script. I can't help but think how reminiscent that highway map is of the division of Africa in the 1890s by Europe. I can't help but think about the very difficult struggle it is to be grassroots and volunteer and try to attend all these ridiculous meetings, as my dear sister from ACE intimated, that are set up for absolutely minimalistic participation by the community. And so 2 of the struggles that I've been involved with recently are United Neighbors of Lower Roxbury, trying to realize the goal of turning land that President Gretchen Jackson, in her great wisdom, first Black woman to have a daily talk show in Boston. I can relate because I was the first Black woman to have a daily talk show in about 20 years, okay? So I can relate to her, and I actually met her and had no idea about her, about the highway movement, about Lower Roxbury, none of this stuff. But I find myself in the last 5 years working 24/7, 7 days a week to realize this goal of building affordable housing with market rate to pay for it, a social space, and economic space, okay? And after that deadly fight that almost killed me, okay? It almost killed Gretchen Jackson too. After that deadly fight, and I'm saying this to the people in the room, go to those meetings. Help the people that are fighting, because one person can't do it. I find myself embroiled in yet another fight. And all these fights are connected to the People Before Highways movement. So, and the other fight is, I will tell you about it now, save the Harriet Tubman House. Save the Harriet Tubman House. Do not believe the hype of USIS, United South End Settlements, which has not been in existence for 127 years. Harriet Tubman House has been in existence since 1904. Okay, but anyway, I'm not on a soapbox or anything. I'm just trying to state facts as I see them. But to come back to this highway map, this divide and conquer, Going to the meetings is not enough. Protesting is not enough. Getting a dynamic on-the-ground running education about real estate development and urban planning, which I had to do, is not enough. So what is it that is going to change the trajectory of people living in skyboxes or poor people living in Fall River, anybody from Fall River, or New Bedford, and only rich white people living in the city? What's going to change that?
Any responses?
I would say it's an alignment of our will, right? And so you're right, any of those actions by themselves, whether it's protest or direct action or education or policy alone, there is no silver bullet. Even from the lessons that I pull out of the Safety Highway fight, everyone who was involved in this movement thought they were going to lose. Even after Governor Sargent said to stop the road, people said that they still felt worried that if there were a new governor, he or she could change his decision. And so the decision to actually put Roxbury Community College on the corridor as a strategic move, not only to make sure that there could be higher education access for people in the community and Black people in particular, they felt like that was a way to safeguard themselves against the future threat of the highway. So to think that people who were engaged in this really thought that they could lose the fight is telling to us. Because sometimes you think that the only way or the only reason to engage in something is because you think it's winnable. And in so many cases that has not been the case in terms of how people approach movement building. Certainly was not the case in this story. And so, listen, your point about what is it? It seems like it takes all of that, but more importantly, it takes the resolve to say we must demand something different because we have the moral authority and the will as the people, as citizens, and we have to put the pressure on the political system and the structures to also reflect our will. And even then, there's no guarantee, but there is no reason not to fight. Because if we take on that stance, then we have totally lost every single thing before we even begin.
And this is my prerogative as a journalist. Follow-up question. So what you said about RCC, Harriet Tubman is connected to RCC because the executive director from Harriet Tubman that helped spend down their $10 million endowment is now over at RCC, disrupting, deconstructing, and destroying Roxbury Community College along with the Black woman president. Just like there's a Black woman president, executive director at USIS.
Now, I thought you were going to say the connection was in David Lee.
Oh, that's another connection.
And the architect for RCC, who in his work has really resolved to express the vision and the design vision of the community as using these spaces as collective, using these spaces as healing kinds of opportunities. So it's interesting how when you think about who are the actors that are involved in these stories, but even from that moment when these buildings were designed, they were really meant to express a very different kind of liberatory vision for these communities, and that's for sure. And they've been for challenges.
Thank you, first of all. You've been in the neighborhood, I've known you for a little bit, and I'm very happy and very proud for the people in this room. We have a chance to win again. Revolutions are born of hope, not oppression. And here again, we're going to create some hope in this room because right there at Manita Cass and Tremont is UNLR. It will be 100% owned by the UNLR after it's done. And 40% of the people will have truly affordable rents. 3 bedrooms, 900. Okay, that's what I wanted to let you know, that the struggle continues with the work that they've done. So now I want to put a question to you because I don't want to be long-winded. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. United Neighbors of Lower Roxbury. This land is our land and nobody else's forever. Wakanda infinity. I want you to learn that here. Say it with me. This land is our land. And nobody else's. Forever. Infinity. Okay. Now, with that said, the lessons that you write about can teach us in the future. But I wanted you to pick out from that beautiful book you've written the most important lesson that will give us the hope that when we take this land and build on it, that we will keep it as an institution forever. How many of you guys are up for that fight? How many of you are up for the fight that you believe to your children's children for 100 years? Okay. We need to learn how they stopped the highway right at that church that we are building on now. We need to know, and we need to hear from what Professor, I was going to say it, Professor Crockett, is going to give us a good answer right now on. But I just wanted to thank you for giving us that book. That book was sitting on the desk of some of the BPDNA. We got $1.2 million from the Article 80 process when we fought and won against a developer who was taking advantage of a local insurance guy that had been there for a long time. That money is now going to be used to build an independent ownership. You own it. We are going to own that. So now I want to hear from you. What is the most important lesson that we can pull from your book that can help us continue, not just with UNLR, but all the other nonprofits, all the other things? You know something, when you plan to own. Plan to include yourself. I like progress when I'm progressing with it.
Thanks for the comment. I think the big lesson for me is the one I had shared a few seconds ago with Nina, which was that people didn't think it was possible. But they didn't let that be the reason why they didn't fight. And so, honestly, that was very surprising to me. In interview with people, and Chuck himself saying that, Chuck said that in highway battles, you don't win traditionally, that the odds are 90-1. And he was very clear-minded about his understanding of that at the time. In the 1960s, he felt like it was not possible. And so I really couldn't understand how you could actually be building a movement for decades, involved in a fight, 60s, 70s, 80s, that you thought was not winnable. You're sacrificing time with your family, sacrificing your earnings, sacrificing your mental health and well-being. How do you stay healthy? How do you stay sane and stay focused on something that you think is not winnable? And so that is a painful lesson, but an important one that we should not forget or sleep on because of Chuck said that he said to not fight was not an option because they felt convicted about what was right, about what was necessary. And to concede what they thought was necessary and right felt like an ultimate defeat before the battle had been even waged. So a very serious lesson, a very sobering lesson for us, for those of us that care about communities and movement building, but we cannot shy away from that kind of truth telling from movement builders themselves.
Very good.
Thank you. So there are a few more questions, and I'm going to say, I love us and y'all. We can't all reach, please. So please, interrogative statements. That means at the end of the statement, your voice goes, because there's a question. Pretty, please. Okay.
Hi, I have a question for the artist, Abigail. I was so captivated by the installation as I came in, and it just evoked so many things for me. It just evoked so many things for me, and I really would love to hear about what was the process for creating the kind of landscape that enveloped us when we walked in the room.
Well, I had never been in this space before, so I didn't know how vast it was, and I I had sent Nia a box of randomness, and so it was also just like making the best with what was at hand, but thinking about how I could contain what I had brought with me, like in this magical box of plastic. So thinking about what could be impactful in a very small space and what could alter your perception of the space as you're coming in. And then also I was thinking about it as, I think, more as like a drawing exercise. So thinking about how you could just draw your attention or maybe feel differently about moving into the space before the information that you were going to be imparted. And then specifically thinking about the drummer's contribution. So I've never asked like a musician to come and play in a space before, so this is a first time thing. But I think a lot about black holes or different kinds of cosmologies, but then thinking about how all of us individually and biologically are a part of that cosmology, since 5% of stardust is like made in our bodies, and thinking about this long timeline that we're actually on, this long continual timeline, and how everything is cyclical. But there is this story that I emailed Leah about. I'm gonna just read a little portion of that. So I actually went on a road trip along I-95 from DC to Jacksonville in 2014, and actually I noticed how it intersected and cut through all of these black neighborhoods on the way down there. And I've been thinking about like making a kind of site response project about that for years, but I haven't gotten around to that. Like, I'm from the Bronx, I-95 cuts right through the Bronx. They have the highest, cases of asthma in New York City and all those other things because of I-95. Anyway. So I don't know if you all know about the Stono Rebellion. Yeah, so I was thinking about that, but I'm going to read this little excerpt that I found online. The Stono Rebellion was the largest slave revolt ever staged in 13 colonies. On Sunday, September 9, 1739, a day of free labor, about 20 slaves under the leadership of a man named Jemmy provided whites with a painful lesson on the African desire for liberty. Many members of the group were seasoned soldiers, either from the Yamansi War or from their experience in their homes in Angola, where they were captured and sold and had been trained in the use of weapons. They gathered at the Stono River and raided a warehouse-like store, Hutchinson's, executing the white owners and placing their victims' heads on the storefront steps for all to see. They moved on to the other houses in the area, killing the occupants and burning the structures, marching through the colony toward St. Augustine, Florida, where under Spanish law they would be free. As the march proceeded, not all slaves joined the insurrection. In fact, some hung back and actually helped hide their masters, but many were drawn to it, and the insurrectionists soon numbered about 100. They paraded down King's Highway, according to sources, carrying banners and shouting liberty. Mukango in their native Kikongo, a word that would have expressed the English ideals embodied in liberty and perhaps salvation. The slaves fought off the English for more than a week before the colonists railed and killed most of the rebels, although some very, very likely reached Fort Mose. Even after colonial forces crushed the Stono uprising, outbreaks occurred, including the very next year when South Carolina executed at least 50 additional rebel slaves. So when I was in South Carolina, I saw a little video about this in one of the visitor centers, and they talked about the drumming that was happening in the parading down King's Highway, which is now US Highway 17. But so it was a call to action with the drumming, so that slaves from nearby plantations were coming out and joining them, so that's how they became 100 strong. So I was thinking about that, and then there's also idea with string theory, where there's potentially or supposedly, 14 different parallel universes occupying this space right now that we can't touch or see. Yes, it's true, right? But that potentially you could communicate with through the right kinds of vibrations. So the drumming was also like maybe an exercise to try to connect to these parallel, dimensions that are occupying here in this space with us right now.
Did you Did you talk about the TV, Abby?
All right, so the TV is on silent, it keeps shutting itself off, but the televisions, you know, old school TVs, when it has the buzz and the sound is on, it emits this high frequency noise, high pitched noise that's leftover radiation from the Big Bang.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Crockett and Abigail DeVille, is that right? For being here with us tonight and sharing your wisdom and genius. I have a question for you, Abigail, about a video that I saw of your work that was community-based and was carrying people through a processional, even like dragging either found objects or making it, I'm not sure, as you were going along. Can you tell us about your process with that and how, what you were effecting as as community interaction and what that meant, what that really represented for you? Could you share that with us?
So that actually ties into what I was just talking about. That procession happened or was the result of the road trip that I took down south. So it was this 10-day road trip. I never really been down south in a U-Haul cargo van. I'm a silly native New Yorker. I don't have a driver's license, so I had to hire a friend to drive the van for me. And we stopped along the way at different specific stops on the, I think it's the Seaboard Air Railroad, which I think was a popular route during the Great Migration for people to travel north along the eastern corridor. So we stopped in many different cities and like went to visitor centers and then went to plantations. And so from going and being in these spaces that were still charged with the people that had lived in them, and then picking up materials along the way so that I could make this kind of something. I was gonna make something with it. I wasn't 100% sure what that was. And then, so the procession grew out of that experience, and there was a public art project called 5x5 in DC that I participated in. And so the procession, the first procession happened in Anacostia in DC, from Frederick Douglass's home to these storefronts that I installed in that were referencing Jacob Lawrence's migration series that were made out of this stuff, trash that I had collected down south. And so then in each iteration from then, there's like things that have been added onto it. So then there was one immediately after that in Harlem on 124th Street from Marcus Garvey Park into the back entrance of the Studio Museum, and then there was another one that happened in Baltimore in 2016. So as thinking about collectively our histories, but also how they're told through the materials that we leave behind, through the materials that are gathered and the things that mean something to us. It doesn't matter in terms of what context we find them in.
Thank you.
And we'll make this the last question. I'm sorry, and then I'd like to do announcements and then dismiss, for lack of a better word.
Hi, my name is Radiant Jasmine. I'm an area activist and artist, art educator, and I would like to ask, thank you all for coming, and ask, how do you nurture yourselves in these academic and large art institutions that you're working in as teachers and artists and as Black women? What are you doing to nurture yourselves?
I would say reading and then family and friends. I've been making more efforts lately to spend time with friends because it's very isolating being alone or being, like a Black artist that talk about Black things, so then people need you, people need your body and the things that you bring for their institution, so it's like they're being inclusive or they're talking about things that maybe they don't actually really care about. So, yes, that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I really agree with what Abigail was saying. For family and friends, it's been really important to me. My family is here. I have a really big family. I'm the only child, but I have a lot of cousins, and that's a blessing. Sometimes it can be a challenge because you love people and you're trying to help them kind of work through whatever they're working through sometimes too. So sometimes that type of resource has to be balanced tenderly. I think the way that you asked the question suggests that you understand that often the institutions where we sit and do our work, although they can be supportive, I sit in an institution that has generated many of the issues that I'm talking about. That was true for me. It's true for me now at MIT. It was true for me previously in government. Sitting inside of Boston City Hall, an actor which historically has been a lead actor in many of the racial assaults, the disinvestment patterns that my family is still struggling through. So I found that there in government and here at MIT as well, same thing, looking for support and elsewhere, making sure to just protect my time and myself, because I recognize that I am in sort of the belly of the thing I'm addressing, and that's never not true. So I think that kind of consciousness is important, and so I appreciate you asking that kind of question, a question that I almost want to ask you as well, and I hope that that's the kind of way that we can read each other as people in the work. How are you taking care of yourself? How are you producing the kind of reality that you need for yourself right now is a critical piece of how we can sustain the work. So I thank you for the question, and I do want to ask you that when you're out.
Thank you very much. Before we leave, can we just give Karilyn and Abigail a round? And I do want to make a few announcements. I have been calling this week my personal Massachusetts Black Independence Week, because there's a Black event happening almost every day this week. Last night was Boston While Black with the Collier Connection. Tonight is Black Trust. Tomorrow night we will have an artist talk from Sierra Peters. She was here, I guess she's gone, who is Eugene's Arts and Cultural Organizing Fellow. And usually we don't have meetings on the fifth week of the month, but we're going to take this special occasion to have Sierra just talk about what's on her mind and what she's working on with us and by herself. Everyone should have gotten a flyer on their seats that gives you more information about that. So it's tomorrow night, 6 p.m. at City Light Theater Urbana. Then Thursday you get a break because it's Halloween. I don't know what anybody's doing for Halloween, but it's not a specifically Black night. Then Friday is the opening night of Mass Black Expo, and there are some partners here in the room. Kofi Calendar of Smarter in the City, Shauna Bryant, who was here earlier, who left Shauna Bryant Consulting, Karilyn Persena, who's in the back with LISC Boston. And so the theme of Mass Black Expo is independence. Thinking about the 400th year of the first person being enslaved in Virginia, in America. And so this year is called the Year of Return. And so from that, the theme of independence, Black independence to be specific, was chosen for the Mass Black Expo. So it's a weekend, it's a Friday, it's a Saturday. There are lots of things happening. LISC Boston is doing a pitch contest on Saturday at what time?
There's two of them. There's one at 12, and there's also another one at 3:30.
Okay, excellent. There will be lots of workshops. Donna Brazil will be keynoting Friday night. And then Ayanna Presley will be keynoting on Saturday. Also on Saturday, we'll be doing another Black Trust. And so our speaker for that Black Trust will be Jackie Patterson, who is the Director of Environmental Justice at National NAACP. So she will be in conversation with myself and with Joyce Clark, who is the Climate Change Justice Chair for the regional body of the NAACP, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of that body. But that's going to be a good conversation. So we'll be working to link climate change with economic justice, with economic health and wealth, and making the case for communities of color having a proactive role in that conversation. That's on the flip side of the flyer. So depending on which seat you were sitting in, you saw one side of the flyer or the other. So as I said, Friday, Saturday, and then finally on Sunday is Hustle to Lex. And that's an event hosted by Shauna Bryant with guest speakers Atia Martin, who was here, who had to leave, Sheena Collier, and Ryan Richardson, who was Miss Black America. So this is a super black week. I would say we should have a contest and see who can get to every single event this week. And we'll figure out a way to compare notes and see who won. With that said, good night.